Well, it's 9:30 in the morning in Bedford, Virginia. And this excited crowd is unloading cars, bringing out luggage, packing luggage on this bus, getting ready to head for Dulles Airport and Paris, France. It's a 7.5-hour flight on Air France from Dulles Airport near Washington, D.C. to Charles de Gaulle Airport, just outside Paris. Since we leave at 5 o'clock local time, that'll put us into Charles de Gaulle about 6:30 in the morning, which will really only be about 12:30 at night our time, so it's going to be a long day. Well, it's 12:30 in the morning our time, 5:30 in the morning Paris time, and we'll be landing in a few minutes. Already started our descent. Charles de Gaulle Airport is very futuristic, coming through these passenger ramps to the main airport. At 7 a.m. the sky is still black, but rush hour traffic is backed up bumper to bumper in both directions as far as you can see. A large part of the roads through the center part of Paris are now all these underground tunnels, only emerging into the light briefly. Crossing the Seine River, and off in the distance in the dawn, the Eiffel Tower. The city of Rouen is about a 2.5-hour drive from Paris, and we've stopped here for lunch here in the old market area. See many old buildings mixed with the very new. This is the oldest restaurant in all of France, but due to the cost of our trip, very inexpensive, we're eating here instead, just a few doors down. Here the streets are all cobblestone and narrow, and very little vehicular traffic, mostly pedestrian. Directly across the street from the oldest restaurant in France is this ultra-modern church, the Cathedral of Joan of Arc. It's spectacular stained glass windows as the inside with radical sweeping lines. Strange contrast to the older buildings around it. It was on this spot that Joan of Arc was burned at the stake. It's not a long walk from the Place Jeanne d'Arc to the most famous cathedral of Rouen, off in the distance with its feathery, lacy stone spires. We'll head there next. Along the way there are lots of narrow pedestrians-only streets and many of these half-timbered buildings. This smaller building along the way has some incredible gargoyles sticking out. I'd like to see them spouting water during a rainstorm. On closer examination, the walls of this building are pitted and pockmarked, reminders of a now long gone war. All of these streets must have their own stories to tell. I wonder what this one is. This ornately carved building I was looking at a little earlier is the Palais de Justice de Rouen, the Municipal Court. And the number of stone carvings is simply amazing. The gargoyles that protrude from this building all over are just incredibly imaginative. pleasant sidewalk cafe for the cool but pleasant October afternoon. You walk around the corner and it strikes you with its sudden appearance. A dramatic spire, so thin and lacy, you wonder how the Cathedral de Notre-Dame de Rouen even stands. Climbs up and up and up. Really breathtaking. Inside, the vaulted arches are equally spectacular, rising probably 3 stories before they close the top. And the central nave is just calculated to inspire a feeling of reverence. Its proportions make you feel small. Even the main doors to the church make you feel small. The main part of the cathedral is laid out in the traditional cruciform shape. And here in the center of the cross, it goes up and up and up and up and up, probably 15 stories, to the part that supports the tall filigree spire that sits on top of this. Those are just so rich in their color. These life-size statues have been removed from the outside of the building as they got too eroded and worn to be safe. Still beautiful. Construction on this started in 1170 and still continues today. Here work is going on some of the statues to be replaced. Above, the main flesh or spire has been built 3 times. The first 2 times out of wood coated with lead, but then set on fire by lightning. It has now been replaced by this cast iron spire that stretches just short of 500 feet into the air. It's just too grand in all its spectacular size and intricacy to take all in. And this church several blocks away, which anywhere else would be incredibly elaborate, seems small by comparison. The Seine flows through Rouen as it does Paris. There's a lot of traffic on it. This evening we stay at the Ibis Hotel, a very modest little hotel on the more modern part of town on the left bank. This side of Rouen has none of the charm of the right bank, although there's nothing wrong with it. It just has the feel of a big city. This morning we are on a walking tour of the cathedral and Rouen. The streets around the main cathedral are still cobblestoned and very narrow with old buildings on both sides, half-timbered. This large courtyard was originally built as a cemetery, a mass grave for people who died in the Black Plague in the 1300s to the 1500s. When they ran out of spaces to bury people in the ground, bones were dug up. These galleries were built at the time like an open cloister, and the bones were stored in the second floor attic. They never burned bodies because they thought if the body was burned, then the resurrection would not take place. All along the edges of this you can see skulls and bones and parts of bodies carved into the wood. This wonderful old clock is quite an instrument with just an hour hand, and above the clock a slowly revolving globe that shows the phases of the moon. Right now it's new moon, and below it a revolving disc that changes once each day at noon to show the day of the week. Headed down the street toward the Place Jeanne d'Arc. This is our room for Tuesday night in Vierville, the Motel Bocage. Actually not in the town of Vierville at all, but off the highway a little bit on this country road. The entrance to the dining room. Its proximity to Saint-Lô and the beaches of Normandy means that it is also a museum. Here's a 1944 U.S. ambulance, beautifully restored. And this building right next to it contains a small museum. Before dinner we took a nice little walk down this country road near the Motel Bocage, and now we're headed back to a dinner with the group. This morning we're stopping in Saint-Lô, a town that was totally leveled during the liberation of Normandy for a special ceremony in recognition of the American troops who gave so much in this part of France. Chapelle de la Madeleine, built in the 1100s, had fallen into disuse, was in private hands, and in 1970 was bought by the city of Saint-Lô. It was restored as a memorial to the GIs who liberated Saint-Lô in 1944. Throughout Normandy, towns that were liberated always fly the American flag next to the French tricolor. And the square in front of La Madeleine has been renamed in honor of September 11th. This is what the city of Saint-Lô looked like after the liberation. It was just totally destroyed. This was the door to the prison in town, and as the liberation began and the bombing began, the Germans just locked the prisoners, many of them members of the French resistance, inside, where they lost their lives during the bombing. During the invasion of Normandy, an incoming shell blew away part of the statue. The rest of the statue was left intact. And they left this as a memorial to all those who died in the Second World War. An exact replica of this has been made, complete with the missing part, and will be placed at the Bedford Memorial next month. In Vierville, we are staying with Madame Martine Labrec and her husband Daniel in this beautiful summer house right on the beach at Omaha Beach. It seems hard to believe that on June 6th, 1944, there were thousands of ships here. This is where some of the most intense resistance was from the Germans to the liberating forces. And way off in the distance, we can see the famous Pointe du Hoc. This evening we are going to a house nearby, just up from the beach, for toasts and drinks and socialization with the people of Vierville-sur-Mer and the folks from Bedford. In back of the house, a little creek comes down to fill this artificial pond, and over at the end there's a little spillway, and this small house that used to be a mill. The old mill was built itself in the 1400s, and there was a working mill wheel here all the way up until the beginning of World War II. It's a wonder the house survived, because right behind it is the remains of an old German bunker.
Probably what they conscripted.
It's a beautiful morning this Friday. The wind that was whipping through here yesterday evening has died down, and we're waiting to go up and join the group from our host family's house, the Labrecs, to join the rest of the group for a day trip to Mont Michel. High tide at Mont Michel. The water comes all the way up to the edges. We will have to scurry all the way up through the one street through the town to the Abbey, because we are supposed to be there in just a few minutes. And there's a causeway that now leads out to it. But even here, at high tide, most of the parking places are underwater. Deliveries can be made as the tide starts to recede. This guy's pushing it a bit.
I would not want that as a used truck.
Beautiful cloisters here. This room has beautiful vaulted Gothic arches. Anywhere from 2 to 5 men used to walk inside this huge wheel to turn the rope attached to a chain that hauled a sledge like this one on rollers up this steep track from the lower levels to haul up the stones for construction and supplies. This room, one of the earliest examples of Romanesque arches, was built in 1106. Huge, massive outside structure was necessary to support the abbey itself that was built really on a point of rock. This part collapsed in the 11th century and was never rebuilt. These lower walls have buttresses on them, and this now walled up gate makes this part of the abbey look more like a castle. Indeed, it had defensive fortifications. Outside the abbey there is only one little narrow pedestrian path plunging down through the town. This is it. On this little tiny street, we've been invited to the house of a relative of Monsieur Labrec for lunch. Inside, there is an absolutely spectacular view. Off in the far distance, you can make out another part of the mainland. The tide is now going out, leaving huge expanses of sand and tidal flats exposed. The tide here is the third highest in the world at about 40 feet difference between high tide and low tide. And here we are about to partake of a marvelous meal with Madame Leclerc. After a lunch that took about 2 hours, we said our goodbyes to Madame Leclerc. Now we're taking a walk along the ramparts, which at low tide look over several kilometers of sand and tidal flat. Back down on the single main street winding up the Mont Saint-Michel, everything's very commercial. In spite of the thousands and thousands of people who visit this spot, probably only about 50 people or less actually live here all year round. It's a good thing it's October instead of the height of the tourist season, or we wouldn't be able to move without great difficulty in these tiny narrow streets. Some streets like this are very narrow, but this is the narrowest one we encountered. If you take a deep breath, I don't think you'll fit. Mont Saint-Michel was not always an abbey. During some of its history, more recent, it was used as a prison after the French Revolution. It seems amazing to think that just in an hour or two, all of this will be underwater again. Mont Saint-Michel, there's very little on the ocean-facing side. If you're brave enough, you can take a tour out onto the Tidal Flats with a guide who makes certain that you're back before the tidal bore comes rushing in again. At high tide, the water will come in and totally cover this parking lot where there are buses now. But time and man wait for no tide, so it's time to head back for the bus for a trip back to Omaha Beach. Although this land probably gets covered at extremely high tides, it's still just very low land, and it's used for sheep grazing because a thin layer of grass grows on the tidal mud. Must be flushed frequently enough with fresh water that grass will grow. We've stopped here to have a drink with the friends of Monsieur Lebrec. The manor house that was originally here where the grass is gone. And their house has been built from what used to be the stables and barn. Today will be a day of pageant and ceremony primarily, starting at Pointe du Hoc, a memorial service to the rangers who climbed the cliff here. The French and the Americans going down this path between the bomb craters and the broken bunkers to place a wreath.
Votre ville de Bedford a tenu à rendre hommage à ses aînés combattants de 1944, venant conquérir sites et plages de notre région.
This gun emplacement still stands, overlooking Pointe du Hoc. It seems hard to believe that anybody could have come up this steep, steep cliff from the ocean, but they did it. Our next stop this morning is at Vierville-sur-Mer, which is the site of the American cemetery. This piece of land has been deeded by the French government to the United States. This is American soil.
Jim, will you do me a favor and stay on the phone, please? Okay.
There are just under 9,400 graves here.
Walk down there and then come back.
This afternoon we're in the city of Bayeux. First stop to see the tapestry. This tower shows the lacy, flamboyant Gothic arches representing flames. The town of Amboise is where Leonardo da Vinci spent the latter part of his life. The final resting place of Leonardo da Vinci's bones are in this little tiny chapel, built especially for that purpose by Napoleon III. His original tomb had been torn down during the whole castle of Chateau d'Amboise. It's built on this flattened area on top of a steep hill overlooking the town. Easily defensible and located conveniently right on the edge of the Loire River. All these beautiful gardens are even more amazing for the fact that it's on top of this huge cliff overlooking the Loire. All along the Loire Valley here we've been encountering cliffs with houses dug right into them.
Look at that huge cat.
This is the room where Leonardo worked, his bedroom, and where he also enjoyed a view of the palace where his benefactor, Francois I, lived. When Leonardo arrived here from Italy, spent the last 3 years of his life, he was carrying the Mona Lisa with him and the unfinished painting of St. John the Baptist, and he probably finished it here in one of these rooms. As we head on up the Loire Valley, we keep seeing large chateaux along the river. Chateau Blois, the residence of kings. During the 100 Years' War between England and France, this was the capital of France, the Loire Valley, shared among several cities, and Louis XII, King of France, built this part of the Chateau Blois. The second wing, also built by the same king, was built in the French Renaissance style. The third wing was built in the classical style, very symmetrical, 2 generations later. The walls here that look like stone are actually canvas painted to look like stone, covering up earlier canvas or wallpaper, and behind that real stone. We stopped for lunch, another 5-course affair, taking a couple hours at Domaine de Seylac. It's 6 o'clock in the evening and we're approaching Paris with roads that look the same as interstates anywhere. The closer we get to the city, the more it looks like the approach to any big city with bumper-to-bumper traffic. We're approaching Paris, crossing the Seine. We're now on the right bank, headed into the center part of town. Much of the major traffic is routed through Paris in these peripherals of périphérique and underground tunnels that take them under the structures of the city itself. Going along this road next to the Seine River, headed toward the Eiffel Tower, taking the scenic route toward our hotel for the evening. As we go under this bridge, here is a small version of the Statue of Liberty. Modern buildings along the side of the river here. Place de la Concorde still looks busy. Place de la Bastille. Our hotel for the next few days, the Comfort Inn, formerly l'Hôtel d'Avoux, located on the Boulevard d'Avoux. We're on the far eastern side of Paris, on the right bank, quite a long ways from the city center, but only a couple hundred yards from the metro. We had a nice late evening supper at this Chinese restaurant. Today is Tuesday, and we've come to pay our respects at this spot just outside Paris, where the Germans brought more than 4,000 members of the French resistance and shot them. The memorial and these bronzes are on the near the top of Mont Valérien in Suresnes, and each one of these bronzes is done by a different French artist. Of course, each one of them is very symbolic. This one representing the liberation, this representing the sailors breaking loose from the tentacles of the Nazis. The outline around the hands is the exact representation of the city limits of Paris, the hand arising with its chains broken loose, dragging down the Nazi hand of oppression. This one represents the members of the French resistance hiding in the forests, the branches in the shape of a V for victory. And here, of course, a phoenix rising from the flames of destruction.
And of course, also the communication.
Whatever happens, the flame of resistance will never be extinguished.
This process is called action.
The German eagle being crushed by the steel hand of the Allies. The monument to the French resistance at Mont is located at one of 16 forts built around Paris during the earlier threats from the east. There was a huge battle with Germans in 1870 that most people don't even remember these days, since no records were kept. And the bodies were immediately transported for burial in other places. It'll never be known how many people were shot here, but they're pretty sure it was somewhere between 4,000 and 6,000 people died at this spot, executed by the Nazis. From Mont you can see a nice vista of Paris, including the L'Arc de Triomphe, La Tour Eiffel, and the newer buildings that rise high above Paris off to one side. Up to get a little fruit for dinner, a bottle of wine. Down the Champs-Élysées.
12 years ago, the surface of the Museum Louvre was multiplied by 2. It's more or less 1/3 sculptures.
We are on the Bateau Mouche on the River Seine, going for a night cruise. Is no longer a train station, but a museum for Impressionist painting. It has these lovely clocks. Going under the Pont Neuf. Many of the bridges in Paris have really been cleaned up, so they're a beautiful creamy color instead of the black stone that I remember. Now we're headed up to the Tour Eiffel to see if we can go up to the first or the second or even the third stage.
Oh my gosh, this is scary! Whoa!
Le deuxième étage, second floor, tout le monde.
Off in the distance there is Sacré-Cœur on the top of Mont, the highest of the 7 hills of Paris. Here is the tomb of Napoleon, and just over there is Notre Dame on Ile de Paris. Over here is the Louvre, Place de la Concorde. Top stage, and it's almost 1,000 feet up, and we're still on the second stage, and still a long way up. From the second stage, it's still possible to walk down to the first stage, which I intend to do. Here we go. Looks like nobody else is doing this. Crazy people like me. I'm not going to do the whole video of this. It gets kind of boring. From the top of the Eiffel Tower, you can't tell that Montmartre is a mountain. Here, on the first stage, you certainly can see its shape. Here we are, walking along the Promenade de l'Australie, the Australian promenade next to the Seine, leaving the Eiffel Tower behind. Getting ready to brave the metro to find our way across to the east side of Paris, back to the hotel. Well, we've made it to the first transfer place in the metro, and we're waiting for the next train, and I think I hear it coming. Yep, there it is. This ought to take us back to within a block of our hotel. Well, we made it through our adventure on the metro. Just a block should take us home to the hotel. Back in our huge hotel room with a bottle of cheap wine and some fruit to end up the evening. Well, it's our last full day in Paris, and we've taken the metro from our hotel to just across the street from the Louvre. We've exited. We're still underground, and we're in a giant mall that has its exit just outside the Louvre itself. We're now standing in line to buy tickets under the famous new glass pyramid by Palais. And looking out through the glass, you can see the traditional building. Taking the elevator from the super modern sub-ground floor into the Louvre is like suddenly going back in time. Paris is becoming an interesting juxtaposition of old and new. Here, looking out on the main plaza of the Louvre, we see the new, radically different architecture of the Pyramid by Palais. In between the Louvre and the small Arc de Triomphe. And behind that, the new neighborhood high-rise area where all the new buildings are in La Défense, beyond the large Arc de Triomphe. Much inside the Louvre is totally unchanged, including the crowds. Each room of the Louvre is just overwhelming in its opulence for its original design. Icarus flying too close and falling down. Daedalus over in the side. Beautiful Victoire de Samothrace the Winged Victory. We're now in the milling crowds of the Grand Gallery. This stretches probably the length close to 2 football fields along this side of the Louvre, devoted to Italian painters. Art students still come here to copy the masters. This is a recent acquisition, although it was painted in 1457. It was only bought in about 10 years ago by Antonello da Messina. And here's his depiction of winter. As always, there's an incredibly huge crowd around Mona Lisa. I think she's probably smiling at all these fools. Panini loved these huge paintings with absolutely incredible detail in them. This one was commissioned to depict the wedding of Louis XV. This one depicting preparations for a festival celebrating the birth of the young Dauphin who was to become Louis XV. And this one showing an incredible array of paintings within paintings depicting buildings in Rome. Each work within the work, a nice piece of art in itself. And this one over here, a series of paintings, studies of buildings using ionic columns. Same idea, paintings within paintings. Well, off to Mont. We've arrived at the foot of Mont. Now we're going to look for the funicular up the hill. Most of the streets here, as in most places in Paris, are cobblestone. You have to walk several blocks from the metro to find the funiculaire that runs up steep Mont. This is the new area of La Défense. Sacré-Cœur is still as beautiful as ever, white against the blue sky, and the view of Paris below is still as spectacular, although there are some changes. The radio station of Radio France. Clustered high-rises of La Défense, all in a part of Paris that keeps them away from the traditional architecture. Seems to be saying, good grief, look at all the new buildings. Some things change, but some things stay the same.
Attends, je l'emmène et puis on donnera le résultat à 2 heures. J'espère que...
Most of the pissoirs of Paris have been replaced by these unisex toilets that you pay 45 cents to use. You go in, you use it, when you're finished and walk out, the whole bottom area is sprayed and disinfected so it's completely clean. Our last evening in Paris, we stopped at a nice little neighborhood restaurant at the bottom of Mont for an excellent meal, inexpensive. We're taking the metro. We begin our trip home tomorrow at 7:15. Our final day in Paris, early in the morning. The usual long standing in lines. The ceilings here are interesting, evoking the aerodynamic airfoil shape of a wing, and where the gates are sort of like the streamlined front of an airplane. And the windows of the main concourse almost look like giant windows, portholes on a spaceship. One final trip in the bus back to Bedford.